Some people say that money can buy anything, but Daniel Carter learned the hard way that wealth often comes with unexpected costs. This is the story of how his search for an heir took an unimaginable turn, leaving him to question everything he thought he knew about trust, love, and family. Don't forget to comment down below from where you are enjoying the story. It was a quiet evening in the hospital room, the faint beeping of monitors echoing in the background. Daniel stood frozen, his arms heavy with the weight of his newborn son. The baby stirred slightly, his tiny hands reaching out instinctively. Maria, the maid who had agreed to become the child's surrogate, sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale and tense. Daniel's gaze was fixed on the baby's face. Something was wrong. His breathing quickened as his mind raced to make sense of the moment. "This can't be," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His expression shifted between confusion and shock, as if he'd been handed a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit. Maria's voice broke through the silence, trembling with uncertainty. "Mr. Carter? What's wrong? Is something wrong with him?" Her question lingered in the air, unanswered. Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching for an explanation she couldn't provide. "Maria, did you know?" he asked, the words heavy with accusation and fear. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes and she shook her head. "Know what? I did everything they told me to. I followed every instruction." The tension in the room was palpable. The doctor stepped forward, sensing the unease. "Mr. Carter, is there a problem? The baby is perfectly healthy." But Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. Something about the child's features, something so eerily familiar, sent a chill down his spine. What was it about this baby that shocked Daniel so profoundly? And why did Maria's presence suddenly feel like part of a much larger mystery? As Daniel handed the baby back to the nurse, his hands trembled. He turned to Maria, his voice low but steady. "We'll talk later, after I figure this out." Maria's heart sank. She'd agreed to this arrangement for one reason, to give her son Alejandro a better future. But in that moment, she realized her decision might have set off a chain of events she couldn't control. Daniel Carter had always believed that wealth could solve any problem. From a young age, he'd learned that success wasn't handed to anyone. It was built through relentless ambition. Born into a working-class family, he'd climbed the ladder of success with grit and determination. By the time he was 40, Daniel had everything: sprawling mansions, luxury cars, and a business empire worth billions. Yet, every evening when he returned to his empty estate, the silence reminded him of the one thing he couldn't buy: family. The death of his wife, Elizabeth, 2 years earlier had left an unfillable void in his life. She had been his anchor, the person who reminded him that life wasn't just about deals and profits. They had tried for years to have children, but after multiple failed attempts, they'd resigned themselves to a childless life. After Elizabeth's passing, the thought of leaving behind his legacy with no one to carry it forward became unbearable. This was why, 6 months ago, Daniel had approached Maria, his maid. Maria had worked for him for over 5 years. She was diligent, respectful, and trustworthy, a quality Daniel valued above all else. But Maria's life was far from easy. As a single mother raising a 7-year-old son, Alejandro, she worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Daniel had always admired her resilience, though their interactions had rarely gone beyond polite exchanges. One evening, as Maria cleaned the grand living room, Daniel brought up the topic. "Maria, may I ask you something personal?" His voice was calm but carried an undertone of vulnerability. Maria paused, turning to him with cautious curiosity. "Of course, Mr. Carter. If you had the chance to secure Alejandro's future, ensure he never had to struggle like you have, would you take it, even if it required a difficult decision?" Her brow furrowed. "I would do anything for my son, but what do you mean by difficult?" Daniel hesitated before explaining his proposition. "I want a child, Maria. I can't have one through conventional means, but I've seen how strong and capable you are. I trust you. If you agree to be the surrogate for my child, I will ensure Alejandro's future is taken care of, financially academically, everything. Maria's heart raced. The offer was overwhelming, both in its generosity and its implications. She thought of Alejandro, who often studied by candlelight when the electricity was cut off. She thought of the nights she skipped meals so he could eat, but she also thought of the ethical and emotional toll this arrangement might bring. "I don't know, Mr. Carter," she said honestly. "This is a lot to process." "I understand," Daniel replied. "Take your time. I only ask because I respect you and know you're capable of this, but the decision is yours." Over the next few days, Maria wrestled with the proposition. She confided in her sister, Sophia, who warned her of the potential complications. "Maria, this isn't just a financial transaction. You'll be carrying his child. That's not something you can just detach from." Maria knew Sophia was right, but she also knew the chance to give Alejandro a better life was rare. Eventually, after much soul-searching, she agreed. Daniel had insisted on drawing up a legal agreement to protect both of them, and the process moved forward with clinical precision. Their arrangement seemed straightforward at first. Daniel paid for the medical procedures, provided Maria with a generous monthly stipend, and gave Alejandro access to better schools and tutors. Yet, as the pregnancy progressed, an unexpected bond began to form between them. Maria saw glimpses of a softer side of Daniel, especially when he interacted with Alejandro. One evening, Daniel noticed Alejandro struggling with a math problem and sat down to help him. As Maria watched from the kitchen, she couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude, and something more complicated that she couldn't quite name. For Daniel, spending time with Alejandro stirred emotions he hadn't felt in years. The boy's laughter and innocence reminded him of what he'd lost with Elizabeth. He began to look forward to the evenings when Maria and Alejandro were around, the once empty mansion feeling a little less hollow. But beneath this growing connection lay an unspoken tension. Maria hadn't told Daniel everything about her past. The truth about Alejandro's father, a man who had vanished from their lives, weighed heavily on her. And Daniel, for all his wealth and control, was still haunted by the fear of being betrayed or abandoned. One evening, as Maria rested on the couch, Daniel noticed a faded photograph peeking out of her bag. It was of Maria, a younger Alejandro, and a man Daniel didn't recognize. He hesitated before asking, "Is that Alejandro's father?" Maria froze. "Yes, but he's not in the picture anymore." Daniel sensed the pain in her voice and didn't press further, though the question lingered in his mind. Who was this man, and why had Maria chosen to keep him out of the story? As the months passed, the pregnancy progressed smoothly, but small, inexplicable moments began to occur. Maria occasionally received cryptic phone calls that left her visibly shaken. Once, Daniel overheard her whispering, "I'm doing this for Alejandro. Please don't interfere." When he asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying it was nothing important. These moments planted seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind, though he tried to push them aside. After all, Maria had always been trustworthy, hadn't she? Despite these undercurrents of tension, the bond between Daniel and Maria grew stronger. He found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. One night, as they sat in the garden watching Alejandro play, Daniel admitted, "I'm not as confident as I seem. Sometimes I wonder if all of this, my wealth, my success, will mean anything once I'm gone." Maria looked at him thoughtfully. "You're giving this child a future. That's more than most people can say." Her words struck a chord, but they also reminded him of the weight of his decision. He had placed his trust in Maria, but the closer they became, the more he feared that trust might be misplaced. What neither of them knew was that the coming months would test their bond in ways they could never have anticipated. Secrets, long buried, were about to surface, and the fragile foundation they'd built would be shaken to its core. As the days turned into weeks, Maria and Daniel's relationship began to shift in ways neither had anticipated. What had started as a strictly professional arrangement was evolving into something far more personal. Both of them were wary of acknowledging it. but the unspoken bond between them was undeniable. One rainy afternoon, Alejandro was playing in the mansion's library while Maria finished her chores. Daniel, who had been reviewing business contracts, found himself distracted by the boy's laughter as he flipped through an oversized book of fairy tales. Alejandro looked up, catching Daniel's curious gaze. "Mr. Carter," Alejandro said timidly, holding up the book, "do you believe in dragons?" Daniel chuckled, setting his papers aside. "I believe dragons are like challenges. They seem scary at first, but once you face them, you realize they aren't so bad." Alejandro's eyes lit up. "Then I'll face every dragon I meet." Maria, watching from the doorway, couldn't help but smile. Moments like these were rare for her son, who had always lacked a consistent male figure in his life. Seeing Daniel step into that role, even briefly, stirred feelings she couldn't quite place: gratitude, admiration, and something deeper she dared not name. Yet, as their connection deepened, so did the tension. Maria's pregnancy was progressing smoothly, but Daniel couldn't ignore the moments of unease that occasionally crossed her face. One evening, as they sat together in the mansion's sunroom, Daniel decided to address it. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice gentle but probing. "Is something on your mind?" Maria hesitated, looking out at the darkened garden. "It's nothing, really. Just thinking about how much my life has changed." Daniel nodded, though her vague response did little to quell his curiosity. "You've been handling everything remarkably well, but if there's ever anything you need to talk about, I hope you know you can trust me." Maria looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Fear? Guilt? She quickly turned away, murmuring, "Thank you, Mr. Carter. That means a lot." The growing tension finally came to a head one night when Daniel found Maria in the kitchen, quietly crying over a letter she'd just opened. She tried to hide it, but Daniel wasn't one to let things slide. "Maria," he said firmly, "what's going on?" She wiped her eyes quickly, shaking her head. "It's nothing, just an old family matter." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He reached for the letter she had crumpled in her hand. "If it's nothing, why are you crying?" Maria froze, her instinct to protect herself and her son warring with her growing trust in Daniel. Finally, she relented, handing him the letter. Daniel's eyes scanned the page and his brow furrowed as he read the contents. It was from Maria's estranged in-laws, accusing her of profiting off their family's tragedy by agreeing to the surrogacy. They hinted at exposing her to Daniel if she didn't cease contact with the Carter family. "Is this true?" Daniel asked, his voice low but intense. "What do they mean by tragedy?" Maria took a deep breath, tears streaming down her face. "It's not what it looks like. My late husband, he wasn't a good man. He owed people money, made enemies, and when he disappeared, his family blamed me for everything." "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel asked, his tone softening. "Because I didn't want you to think I was bringing trouble into your life," Maria replied, her voice trembling. "I've spent years trying to leave that part of my life behind, but they just won't let me." The revelation shifted the dynamics between them. Daniel wanted to protect Maria and Alejandro, but he also couldn't ignore the doubts creeping into his mind. Was there more to Maria's past than she was letting on? And if so, could it jeopardize the future he was building for his child? Meanwhile, Maria grappled with her conflicting emotions. She had agreed to the surrogacy out of necessity, but over time she'd come to care deeply for Daniel, not just as an employer, but as a person. Yet, her feelings were complicated by her guilt and the constant fear that her past would ruin everything. Their conversations became layered with subtext, each of them saying one thing but meaning another. One evening, as they discussed baby names, Daniel casually mentioned his estranged brother Charles, who had disappeared years ago after a bitter family feud. "Do you ever think about reconciling with him?" Maria asked cautiously. Daniel shook his head. "Some wounds don't heal, Maria. Sometimes it's better to let the past stay buried. His words hit Maria harder than he realized. She wondered if the same could be said of her own past, and if her secrets would eventually push Daniel away. Despite the growing tension, moments of vulnerability continued to draw them closer. One night, after a particularly stressful day, Daniel found Maria sitting by the fireplace staring into the flames. "Do you ever feel like no matter how much you try, it's never enough?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel sat down beside her, surprised by the rawness of her question. "All the time," he admitted. "I've built an empire, but at the end of the day, what does it matter if there's no one to share it with?" Maria turned to him, her eyes glistening. "You're not alone, Daniel. You've given me and Alejandro more than I could have ever hoped for. That means something." Her words touched him deeply, and for a moment the walls between them seemed to crumble. But before either of them could say more, Alejandro burst into the room, holding a drawing he'd made for Daniel. A family portrait that included all three of them, plus the unborn baby. "Look, Mr. Carter, it's us!" Alejandro exclaimed, beaming with pride. Daniel's heart swelled as he took the drawing, but the sight of it also brought a pang of uncertainty. Could this really be his family? And if so, what did that mean for the boundaries he'd worked so hard to maintain? Later that night, Daniel sat alone in his study, staring at the drawing Alejandro had given him. The lines were childish, the colors uneven, but the sentiment behind it was clear. For Alejandro, they were already a family. But for Daniel, the question remained. Could he truly let go of his fears and trust Maria? Just as he began to ponder this, his phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator he'd hired months ago. The message was brief, but chilling. "Found something you need to see. Sending the file now." Daniel's stomach churned as he opened the email. His eyes scanned the document and his blood ran cold. Whatever he had just discovered threatened to unravel everything. If you are enjoying the story till now, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue. The following morning, Daniel couldn't shake the weight of the email he'd received the night before. He sat in his study, the file open on his laptop. It contained background information on Maria's late husband, Hector Reyes, and his connections to Daniel's estranged brother, Charles Carter. The investigator's summary revealed a startling fact. Hector had been a business associate of Charles, and their dealings were fraught with betrayal and financial loss. The file hinted that Maria might have known more than she let on. Daniel's mind swirled with questions. Was Maria part of a scheme? Could she have knowingly entered his life with ulterior motives? Yet, as he thought about the moments they'd shared, the sincerity in her eyes, the sacrifices she'd made for Alejandro, he struggled to reconcile these doubts with the woman he had come to trust. Unable to contain his turmoil, Daniel confronted Maria later that day. He found her in the garden, tending to a patch of flowers she'd planted with Alejandro. "Maria, we need to talk," Daniel said, his tone sharp but controlled. Maria straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "What's wrong?" Daniel held up his phone, displaying a picture of Hector with Charles. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Maria's face paled and she took a step back. "Where did you get that?" "That's not the point," Daniel snapped. "I trusted you, Maria. I've welcomed you into my home, into my life, and now I find out that your husband was connected to my brother, the same brother who betrayed my family and disappeared. Did you know about this when you agreed to the surrogacy?" Maria's voice shook as she replied. "I didn't know until after Hector was gone, and I didn't think it mattered because I've never met your brother. Whatever they did, I had nothing to do with it." "Didn't think it mattered?" Daniel's voice rose. "You've been hiding this from me, Maria. How am I supposed to believe you now?" Tears welled up in Maria's eyes, but she stood her ground. "Because I've done nothing but prove my loyalty to you and your child. I agreed to this arrangement to give my son a better future, not to deceive you." The tension between them grew unbearable. Over the following days, their interactions became strained and distant. Daniel, plagued by doubts, began to withdraw, while Maria felt the weight of his suspicion crushing her. One evening, Alejandro noticed the change. "Why is Mr. Carter so sad, Mama?" he asked, his innocent question cutting straight to Maria's heart. "He's just going through something, sweetheart," Maria replied, trying to hide her own pain. But she knew she couldn't keep the truth from Daniel forever. Despite the rift between them, both Daniel and Maria found themselves united by their shared concern for the unborn child. When Maria experienced a health scare, a sudden bout of dizziness and shortness of breath, it was Daniel who rushed her to the hospital, staying by her side the entire time. As Maria rested in the hospital bed, she looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with regret. "I know you have every reason to doubt me, but I swear to you, I've never wanted anything but the best for this child." Daniel softened, the vulnerability in her voice stirring something within him. "I want to believe you, Maria, but trust doesn't come easy for me." Maria nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Then let me prove it to you, whatever it takes." In the days that followed, Daniel began digging deeper into the file on his brother. What he discovered shocked him. Charles had been involved in a series of shady deals that had left multiple families, including Maria's, in financial ruin. Hector, it seemed, had been both a victim and a participant in Charles's schemes. Daniel's anger toward Charles reignited, but it was accompanied by a newfound empathy for Maria. She had suffered the consequences of his brother's actions just as Daniel had. The realization brought them closer, even as it added new layers of complexity to their relationship. Maria, meanwhile, struggled with her own feelings of guilt and isolation. One evening, as she sat alone in her room, she wrote a letter to Alejandro, explaining the decisions she'd made and the sacrifices she'd endured to give him a better life. She didn't plan to give it to him anytime soon, but the act of writing it helped her process her emotions. At the same time, Daniel found himself revisiting old family photos, particularly those of him and Charles as children. The memories were bittersweet, a reminder of the bond they'd once shared before greed and betrayal tore them apart. The tension between Daniel and Maria finally came to a head during a late-night conversation in the library. Maria, unable to bear the strain any longer, confessed everything: the full extent of Hector's dealings with Charles, her struggles after his disappearance, and her fear that her past would ruin the future she was trying to build for her son. "I didn't choose this life, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking, "but I'm trying to make the best of it. For Alejandro, for your child, for all of us." Daniel listened in silence, his own emotions churning. When she finished, he let out a deep sigh. "I've spent so much of my life building walls, Maria. Walls to keep people out, to protect myself. But maybe it's time I let someone in." Maria looked at him, her eyes wide with hope. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm willing to try," Daniel said. "But it has to be built on honesty, from both of us." From that moment, their relationship began to shift once again. It wasn't easy, trust is never rebuilt overnight, but they started to find common ground. Daniel began involving Maria in decisions about the baby, and Maria, in turn, opened up about her dreams for Alejandro's future. Alejandro, sensing the change, began to flourish in the newfound harmony. His laughter once again filled the mansion, and his joy became a beacon of hope for both Daniel and Maria. Just when it seemed like things were finally settling, another twist emerged. Daniel received an unexpected call from the investigator, who had uncovered a critical piece of information. A document proving that Charles, despite his disappearance, had been siphoning money from one of Daniel's offshore accounts for years. The implications were staggering. If Charles was still alive, could he somehow be connected to Maria's sudden reappearance in Daniel's life? And if so, what would that mean for the fragile trust they had just begun to rebuild? As Daniel hung up the phone, his mind raced with possibilities. He knew the answer would change everything, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. What will Daniel discover next, and how will it affect his relationship with Maria? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to find out. Let's continue the story. The air in Daniel's office was thick with tension as he pored over the document sent by the investigator. The revelation that his estranged brother Charles was still alive and siphoning money from Daniel's accounts shattered the fragile sense of stability he had begun to rebuild. The timing couldn't have been a coincidence. Questions swirled in his mind. Was Maria somehow connected to Charles? Or was this yet another twist of fate that tied their lives together? Daniel knew he couldn't jump to conclusions, but he also couldn't let this go unanswered. He picked up his phone and called Maria, asking her to meet him in the study. When she arrived, the anxiety on her face mirrored his own. "Maria," Daniel began, his tone measured but firm. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Maria nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Of course. What is it?" He handed her the document. "Do you know anything about this? About Charles? About what he's been doing?" Maria's eyes scanned the paper, her brow furrowing. I don't understand. Charles Carter? This is your brother?" Daniel nodded. "He disappeared years ago after stealing from the family business. Now it seems he's been stealing from me again, and I need to know if there's any connection to you or to Hector." Maria looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. "Daniel, I swear to you I didn't know about this. I've never even met your brother. Hector never mentioned his name." For a moment, Daniel studied her, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was sincerity and fear. Despite Maria's assurances, Daniel couldn't ignore the possibility of a deeper connection. He decided to investigate further, delving into Hector's financial records and uncovering a web of transactions that led back to one of Charles's shell companies. The implications were clear. Hector had been a pawn in Charles's schemes, and Maria, whether she knew it or not, had been caught in the crossfire. Maria, upon hearing this, was devastated. "I knew Hector wasn't a good man," she admitted, tears streaming down her face, "but I never imagined he was involved in something like this. I tried so hard to shield Alejandro from his mistakes. I never wanted his past to touch our future." Daniel softened at her words, the raw emotion in her voice breaking through his defenses. "I believe you, Maria," he said quietly. "But this isn't just about Hector anymore. Charles is still out there, and if he's been watching us, it's only a matter of time before he makes a move." As the days passed, the tension between Daniel and Maria became both a source of strength and a test of their resolve. They found themselves working together to uncover the truth about Charles, each bringing their own skills and perspectives to the table. Maria, despite her fear, showed incredible resilience. She combed through old letters and photos, searching for clues that might connect Hector to Charles. Daniel, meanwhile, used his resources to track down former associates of his brother, piecing together a timeline of events that led to the present. Their shared mission brought them closer, but it also exposed their vulnerabilities. One evening, as they sat in the library, Maria looked at Daniel and said, "I'm scared, Daniel. Not just for me, but for Alejandro. What if Charles comes after us?" Daniel reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I won't let that happen, Maria. Not to you, not to Alejandro, and not to this child. We'll face whatever comes together." Just as they began to make progress, a new piece of information came to light, one that threatened to upend everything. The investigator discovered that Charles had recently been spotted in a nearby city, living under an alias. More importantly, he had been seen with a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Maria. When Daniel shared this with Maria, she was stunned. "That's impossible," she said, shaking her head. "I don't have any sisters or cousins who could look like me." "Then who is she?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "And why is she working with Charles?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as both of them grappled with the implications. If this woman wasn't related to Maria, then she was likely someone from Charles's world, someone who could potentially threaten their fragile peace. The revelation pushed Daniel and Maria to their limits. Daniel, consumed by his need to protect his family, began to pull away emotionally, his fear manifesting as anger and suspicion. Maria, feeling the weight of his doubt, retreated into herself, unsure of how to bridge the growing divide. Their once budding relationship now felt strained, and even Alejandro began to sense the tension. One evening, as Daniel sat alone in his study, Alejandro approached him with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Carter," Alejandro said softly, "are we still a family?" The question broke through Daniel's defenses, forcing him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. Despite everything, he cared deeply for Maria and Alejandro, and he couldn't let fear drive them apart. Determined to confront Charles once and for all, Daniel made the decision to track him down. He enlisted Maria's help, knowing that her perspective could be invaluable. Together, they pieced together the final clues, uncovering a location where Charles was likely hiding. As they prepared for the confrontation, Daniel took a moment to address Maria directly. "No matter what happens, I need you to know that I trust you. I may not have always shown it, but I do." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know." Their resolve strengthened, they set out to face the man who had been the source of so much pain and uncertainty in their lives. As they arrived at the secluded location, the tension was palpable. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Daniel's heart raced as he prepared to confront his brother. But when the door swung open, it wasn't Charles who stood before them. It was the woman who looked just like Maria. The woman standing in the doorway looked eerily like Maria, but her expression was colder, sharper, a stark contrast to Maria's warmth. Daniel and Maria froze, their breath caught in their throats as they tried to make sense of the surreal moment. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice steady but laced with tension. The woman smirked, leaning against the doorframe as if she'd been expecting them. "I could ask you the same question, but I suppose introductions are overdue." She extended a hand toward Maria. "My name is Elena. You must be the maid." Maria's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here, and why do you look like me?" Elena let out a short, bitter laugh. "It's not that complicated, really. We share a father. Different mothers, of course. Didn't your dear mother ever tell you about her little secret?" Maria staggered back, her face pale. "No, that's not possible." Elena shrugged, her casual demeanor belying the tension in the room. "Believe what you want, but I'm here because of Charles. He's been very helpful in unraveling the family mess you found yourself in." Before Maria could respond, a voice called out from the shadows, "That's enough, Elena." Charles stepped into view, his presence commanding and unmistakable. He looked older than Daniel remembered, but his smug expression hadn't changed. "Hello, brother," Charles said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "It's been a long time." Daniel's fists clenched. "Not long enough." Charles chuckled, taking a step closer. "Always so dramatic. I must say you've built quite the life for yourself. But you've also made some interesting choices, like trusting a woman who has more ties to our past than you realize." Maria glared at him. "I don't know you, and I don't care about your schemes. All I want is to protect my son and this child." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But you see, Daniel, trust has always been your weakness. You assume people's motives are pure, but everyone has a price." "Enough," Daniel snapped. "Whatever you're trying to do, it ends here. I want the money you stole, and I want you out of my life." Charles smirked. "You really think it's that simple? This isn't just about money, dear brother. This is about control, and as long as I hold the keys to your secrets, I'll always have control." As the tension escalated, Maria stepped forward, her voice steady and resolute. "You think you can manipulate us with half-truths and fear, but you're wrong. I don't care about your games, and I won't let you hurt my family." Her words struck a chord with Daniel. For the first time, he realized how much Maria had endured, not just because of her past, but because of the burden he had placed on her. Her strength, her resilience, was what had kept their fragile family together. Daniel turned to Charles, his voice cold and unwavering. You're right about one thing. Trust is a weakness, but it's also a strength. And I trust Maria. I trust her more than I've ever trusted you." Charles's smirk faltered for the first time, but he quickly recovered. Touching, but words won't change anything. In a bold move, Daniel revealed that he had contacted the authorities and shared all the evidence of Charles's fraudulent activities. "You're done, Charles. You have no leverage anymore." Charles's face darkened, but before he could respond, Elena stepped forward. "I'm not going down for this," she said, her voice firm. "I don't owe you anything, Charles." The rift between Charles and Elena became apparent as they began to argue. Taking advantage of the distraction, Daniel signaled to Maria, and they quietly moved toward the exit. Just as they reached the door, Charles shouted, "You think you can just walk away from this?" He lunged toward Daniel, but Maria stepped in his path, her fierce determination stopping him in his tracks. "You've caused enough damage," Maria said, her voice steady. "It's over." As the police arrived to arrest Charles and Elena, Daniel and Maria stood side by side, watching the chaos unfold. For Daniel, it was the closure he had long sought, an end to the chapter of betrayal and mistrust that had haunted him for years. For Maria, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could finally leave her past behind. But the most profound moment came when Daniel turned to Maria and said, "Thank you for standing by me, even when I doubted you. I'll never make that mistake again." Maria smiled, her eyes brimming with emotion. "And thank you for trusting me. That's all I ever wanted." As they drove away from the scene, Maria glanced at Daniel, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think it's really over?" Daniel hesitated before replying. "I don't know, but whatever comes next, we'll face it together." In the back seat, Alejandro held the drawing he'd made of their family. "We're stronger than dragons, right, Mr. Carter?" he asked, his innocent words carrying a deeper truth. Daniel smiled. "That's right, Alejandro. Stronger than dragons." But as they disappeared into the night, a shadowy figure watched from a distance, a phone pressed to their ear. "They think it's over," the figure said, their voice low and menacing. "But it's just the beginning." The mansion was quiet that evening, the kind of peace Daniel hadn't felt in years. As he sat by the fireplace, Maria entered the room carrying a cup of tea. Alejandro was already asleep upstairs, clutching the stuffed dragon Daniel had bought him a few weeks earlier. Maria handed Daniel the tea, her expression calm but thoughtful. "It feels different now, doesn't it? Like something's shifted." Daniel nodded, staring into the flames. "It has. For the first time in a long time, I feel free. Not from responsibility, but from the fear that's always come with it." Maria sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "You've faced a lot, Daniel, and you've given so much. I hope you know that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of quiet that comes with understanding. Daniel turned to Maria, his gaze steady. "You've given just as much, Maria. If it weren't for you, I don't know if I'd have had the strength to face my brother or to trust again." Maria smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We've both carried a lot, but I think we finally let it go." In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Maria worked to rebuild their lives. The baby was born healthy, a symbol of the hope and resilience that had carried them through their darkest moments. Alejandro, now thriving in his new school, took to his role as a big brother with enthusiasm and pride. Daniel began to focus less on his business empire and more on the family he was building. He spent evenings helping Alejandro with homework, rocking the baby to sleep, and sharing quiet conversations with Maria about their plans for the future. Maria, for her part, found herself embracing the sense of belonging she had always craved. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was living. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden with the children, Maria paused to look at Daniel. Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had been different? If we hadn't crossed paths? Daniel considered her question, a small smile playing on his lips. I used to, but not anymore. Because every step we took, every hardship, every mistake, it led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be. Maria reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. Me too. As they stood there, watching Alejandro chase butterflies while the baby cooed in Daniel's arms, it was clear that their journey wasn't just about overcoming challenges, it was about finding strength in each other and building a future filled with hope. Daniel turned to the camera, breaking the fourth wall with a warm smile. Some people say family is something you're born into, but I've learned that family is something you build, piece by piece, with trust, love, and resilience. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.